to psychology, human performance, even the drives that brought Papa Joe and your Grammy to New York 100 years ago?
I think the short take, which is unfortunately not very profound or normative or doesn't resolve a great deal, is that whatever emotional, behavioral predispositions we might have obtained evolutionarily, and which therefore may in part, and only in part, reside within us genetically, they're not for the most part determinative. They may give us certain predispositions to certain kinds of behaviors, but what's overwhelmingly true about humans is the great flexibility that we have to alter even those behaviors to which we're predisposed if we decide that they're immoral or that they don't fit well with current technological capacities. For example, maybe it was under certain circumstances with sticks and stones adaptively advantageous to be nasty to our neighbors. It certainly may not be in a nuclear world. The other fact that's relevant, which is a real discovery of the last 20 years, is that all human beings alive today share a much more recent African common ancestry than we ever thought, and therefore we're just so much more similar one to the other. You can't look at a group, whether it's the Yanomami in South America, the Khoisan of Southern Africa, the Finns of Northern Europe, and say, well, they're different because they're just different people. We're all so similar. The genetic differences among even our culturally and geographically most disparate groups are so much smaller than we ever thought even a few years ago.
When did we
now have to see that as coming out of our different flexibilities.
When did we discover that?
Really only in the last 20 years, because before that you could not measure. There were no techniques whereby you could measure the average genetic differences among human beings.
But so, and what's the... Where do we go from that understanding that we are the human brain, basically the world around, is born the same?
Towards an understanding that the enormous cultural differences among far-flung people in different parts of the globe are coming out of a common genetic heritage that we all share, and therefore are not due to particular and highly specific determinative genes that are held by one group of people and not by others. We're a very variable species, but that variability exists within each of our populations. It doesn't distinguish differences between them.
Well, but then when the Yanomami, say, Stone Age people in the highlands of Brazil are studied and described first as the fierce people, and then described as sort of playing out our genetic inheritance with a tremendous rate of male conflict. What generalization should be drawn from something like that?
I can't comment. I haven't even read Tierney's book, though I haven't. I've never met Dr. Chagnon. I can't comment on the details of that controversy. It may well be that certain groups of folks have fairly high degrees of aggressivity, but there are other groups that have been described in other parts of the world that are equally pacific and therefore show again the enormous range within Homo sapiens, but I can't comment on the actual merits of one side or another of the particular Yanomami case.
When people do start talking, though, Steve Gould, about the evolution of social behavior, of social roles, in the same, well, in analogy to the development of, a bird's claws or beaks or eyes or whatever, I mean, physical characteristics, what general cautions do you toss down about evolution in social behavior?
To recognize, to continue that analogy, if you want to make it to the bird's claws or beaks, what you're talking about in Homo sapiens, again, ranging from the Yanomami to the Finns to the Khoisan, you're making an analogy to the form of the beak in one species of bird. You're not talking about the very different beaks, even of different species of Darwin's finches, that are adapted to very different environments through the selection of different genes. You're talking about variation within one single species, and therefore you're not talking about genetically and evolutionarily set differences. You're talking about different ways of expressing in different social circumstances a common genetic heritage that all human beings share.
This is calling from Oaks, North Dakota.
Yes.
Welcome, Ron.
Thank you very much. Professor Gould, it's wonderful to talk to you. I've read some of your books.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to hear from one of those states that has 2 senators and only 1 member of the House of Representatives.
And our representative is a Democrat, and had this
God bless you.
Had he gone to the House of Representatives since North Dakota went for President-elect Bush, he was going to vote for Bush had it gone that far. He had made that known. But at any rate, my question deals with what I thought was one of your most fascinating essays, the islands that were formed in Hawaii by the lava fields. Mm-hmm. And I thought that your discussion of evolution within those islands was a beautiful proof of evolution. And the other thing I'd like you to comment on is Kenneth Miller's book, Finding Darwin's God. As a religious person, I was kind of relieved to read that book and to see the dovetailing he did with religion and evolution.
Me too.
Because I believe in both. And I'd like you to comment on that.
No, I think we all agree with that. Ken Miller's been a friend of mine for ages. He is a religious Catholic and one of the most effective spokespeople for evolution in the country. In fact, because he's a good debater, given that verbal Irish heritage of his, he's actually gone out there and just trounced Duane Gish and Morris and all those other creationist debaters. I generally don't think you ought to debate them in public because it just gives them the publicity we don't want to heap upon them, but Miller has absolutely trounced them. But all he's doing and has been doing is, in fact, supporting the traditional Catholic perspective as validated by popes ranging from Pius XII, not one of my favorite figures in 20th century history, to the current pope, namely that science and religion are separate things, and a religious person, a Catholic in particular, since that's their domain, may certainly believe whatever science finds out about the evolution of the human body, so long as they believe that at some point God chose to infuse the human soul into that natural entity. Now, I happen to have a different position about human souls, but that doesn't matter. That has nothing to do with science. That's not my bailiwick. I have no factually informed expertise on that particular subject. And no, I think what Ken is doing in that book is speaking for a large majority of both scientific people and religious professionals in the United States and in the world, for that matter, what has been the standard consensus position for 100 years, that science and religion are entirely compatible because they deal with different issues. Science is about the factuality of nature insofar as we can determine it, and religion is about ethics, values, and the meaning of life, and science can't answer those questions, and religion is not meant to discourse on the world's factuality. The Bible's not a treatise on natural history, and science is not a moral compendium.
And the age of the rocks doesn't determine the Rock of Ages.
Yes, that famous line.
Yeah. Did you want to speak to Ron's question or point about your Pacific Islands? And
the Hawaiian Island case is very interesting because the Hawaiian Islands, since they've been formed sequentially in time, because there's apparently one source of island material, a hotspot in the Pacific Ocean, the islands get older and older as you move away from the current volcanoes, which are over the Big Island towards Kauai at the northwest. So you have, in a sense, a natural chronometer. The islands get younger and younger from Kauai to the Big Island, and you can use that to calibrate the evolution of various forms that are living on those islands. That's why it's such a good case.
Ron, thank you for calling. 1-800-423-8255. Adam is on the line.
Hi, good morning.
Morning, Adam.
You guys touched on this briefly earlier in the show, but my question to Mr. Gould was, do you think that we as a species, due to our technological advancement and pseudo-control over our environment, have we escaped from the natural selection? And if your answer is no, we haven't, then what do you think the current selection pressures on us are?
I think it's funny. I'm glad you asked that. That question is always asked, because it's a good question, mind you. But nonetheless, it is based upon a misconception. I don't say that to be critical at all of the caller. It's a misconception that almost everyone has and is almost inevitable. But the misconception is that there's something about human culture that slows down, distorts, or in otherwise distresses the natural tendency of natural selection to weed out the weak and to preserve the strong, and that therefore, since we now can preserve the weak, that natural selection has ceased to operate in humans or has slowed down. The point, I think, is that natural selection is such a weak force anyway that given the enormous speed of human cultural change, which is a non-genetic, special, and unique style of change that's only come upon this planet with the evolution of human consciousness. By the way, human cultural change is Lamarckian. That's why it's so fast, because whatever we learn in one generation, we teach directly to the next.